Self-esteem. Self-esteem is an individual's subjective evaluation of their own worth. Self-esteem encompasses beliefs about oneself. For example, I am unloved, I am worthy, as well as emotional states such as triumph, despair, pride, and shame. Smith and Mackey, 2007, defined it by saying the self-concept is what we think about the self. Self-esteem is the positive or negative evaluations of the self, as in how we feel about it. Self esteem is an attractive psychological construct because it predicts certain outcomes, such as academic achievement, happiness, satisfaction in marriage and relationships, and criminal behavior. Self esteem can apply to a specific attribute or globally. Psychologists usually regard self esteem as an enduring personality characteristic. Trait self esteem. Through though normal short-term variation state self-esteem also exist. Synonyms or near synonyms of self-esteem include self-worth, self-regard, self-respect, and self-integrity. It is a controversial term between academics due to some believing that the concept does not exist and is better measured by extroversion and introversion trait levels. Jordan Peterson and Albert Ellis are two of the most prominent psychologists to criticize the term. History. The concept of self-esteem has its origins in the 18th century, first expressed in the writings of the Scottish Enlightenment thinker David Hume. Hume posits that it is important to value and think well of oneself because it serves a motivational function that enables people to explore their full potential. The identification of self esteem as a distinct psychological construct has its origins in the work of philosopher, psychologist, geologist, and anthropologist William James, 1892. James identified multiple dimensions of the self, with two levels of hierarchy process of knowing called the I self, and the resulting knowledge about the self, the me self. The observation about the self and storage of those observations by the I self creates three types of knowledge, which collectively account for the me self, according to James. These are the material self, social self, and spiritual self. The social self comes closest to self esteem, comprising all characteristics recognized by others. The material self consists of representations of the body and possessions, and the spiritual self of descriptive representations and evaluative dispositions regarding the self. This view of self esteem as the collection of an individual's attitudes toward itself remains today. In the mid 1960s, social psychologist Morris Rosenberg defined self esteem as a feeling of self worth and developed the Rosenberg Self Esteem Scale, RSES, which became the most widely used scale to measure self esteem in the social sciences. In the early 20th century, the behaviorist movement minimized introspective study of mental processes, emotions, and feelings, replacing introspection with objective study through experiments on behaviors observed in relation with the environment. Behaviorism viewed the human being as an animal subject to reinforcements and suggested placing psychology as an experimental science, similar to chemistry or biology. As a consequence, clinical trials on self esteem were overlooked, since behaviorists considered the idea less liable to rigorous measurement. In the mid 20th century, the rise of phenomenology and humanistic psychology led to renewed interest in self esteem. Self esteem then took a central role in personal self actualization and in the treatment of psychic disorders. Psychologists started to consider the relationship between psychotherapy and the personal satisfaction of persons with high self esteem as useful to the field. This led to new elements being introduced to the concept of self esteem, including the reasons why people tend to feel less worthy and why people become discouraged or unable to meet challenges by themselves. In 1992, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama associated self-esteem with what Plato called thymos, the spiritedness, part of the Platonic soul. As of 1997, the core self-evaluations approach included self-esteem as one of four dimensions that comprise one's fundamental appraisal of oneself, along with locus of control, neuroticism, and self-efficacy. The concept of core evaluation is first examined by Judge Locke in Durham, 1997. has since proven to have the ability to predict job satisfaction and job performance. Self esteem may be essential to self evaluation. In public policy, the importance of self esteem gained endorsement from some government and non government groups starting around the 1970s, such that one can speak of a self esteem movement. This movement can be used as an example of promising evidence that psychological research can have an effect on forming public policy. The underlying idea of the movement was that low self esteem was the root of problems for individuals, making it the root of societal problems and dysfunctions. A leading figure of the movement, psychologist Nathaniel Branden, stated, I cannot think of a single psychological problem, from anxiety and depression to fear of intimacy or of success to spouse battery or child molestation, that is not traced back to the problem of low self esteem. Self esteem was believed to be a cultural phenomenon of Western individualistic societies. Since low self esteem was not found in collectivist countries such as Japan, concern about low self esteem and its many presumed negative consequences led California Assemblyman John Vasconcellos to work to set up and fund the task force on self esteem and personal and social responsibility in California. In 1986, Vasconcellos argued that this task force could combat many of the state's problems, from crime and teen pregnancy to school underachievement and pollution. He compared increasing self esteem to giving out a vaccine for a disease. It could help protect people from being overwhelmed by life's challenges. The task force set up committees in many Californian counties and formed a committee of scholars to review the available literature on self esteem. This committee found very small associations between low self esteem and its assumed consequences, ultimately showing that low self esteem was not the root of all societal problems and not as important as the committee had originally thought. However, the authors of the paper that summarized the review of the literature still believe that self esteem is an independent variable that affects major social problems. The task force disbanded in 1995, and the National Council for Self-Esteem and later the National Association for Self-Esteem (NASE) was established, taking on the task force's mission. Vasconcelos and Jack Canfield were members of its advisory board in 2003, and members of its Masters Coalition included Anthony Robbins, Bernie Siegel, and Gloria Steinem. Theories. Many early theories suggested that self esteem is a basic human need or motivation. American psychologist Abraham Maslow included self esteem in his hierarchy of human needs. He described two different forms of self esteem: the need for respect from others in the form of recognition, success, and admiration, and the need for self respect in the form of self love, self confidence, skill, or aptitude. Respect from others was believed to be more fragile and easily lost than inner self esteem. According to Maslow, without the fulfillment of the self esteem need, individuals will be driven to seek it and unable to grow and obtain self actualization. Maslow also states that the healthiest expression of self esteem is the one which manifests in the respect we deserve for others, more than renown, fame, and flattery. Modern theories of self esteem explore the reasons humans are motivated to maintain a high regard for themselves. Sociometer theory maintains that self esteem evolved to check one's level of status and acceptance in one's social group. According to terror management theory, self esteem serves a protective function and reduces anxiety about life and death. Carl Rogers, 1902-1987, an advocate of humanistic psychology, theorized the origin of many people's problems to be that they despise themselves and consider themselves worthless and incapable of being loved. This is why Rogers believed in the importance of giving unconditional acceptance to a client, and when this was done, it could improve the client's self esteem. In his therapy sessions with clients, he offered positive regard no matter what. Indeed, the concept of self esteem is approached since then in humanistic psychology as an inalienable right for every person, summarized in the following sentence: every human being, with no exception, for the mere fact to be it, it is worthy of unconditional respect of everybody else. He deserves to esteem himself and to be esteemed. measurement. Self esteem is typically assessed using self report inventories, one of the most widely used instruments. The Rosenberg Self Esteem Scale, RSES, is a 10-item self esteem scale score that requires participants to indicate their level of agreement with a series of statements about themselves. An alternative measure, the Coppersmith inventory, uses a 50-question battery over a variety of topics and asks subjects whether they rate someone as similar or dissimilar to themselves. If a subject's answers demonstrate solid self regard, the scale regards them as well adjusted. If those answers reveal some inner shame, it considers them to be prone to social deviance. Implicit measures of self esteem began to be used in the 1980s. These rely on indirect measures of cognitive processing thought to be linked to implicit self esteem, including the name letter task or initial preference task and the implicit association task. Such indirect measures are designed to reduce awareness of the process of assessment. When using them to assess implicit self esteem, psychologists apply self reliant stimuli to the participant and then measure how quickly a person identifies positive or negative stimuli. For example, if a woman was given the self relevant stimuli of female, and mother psychologists would measure how quickly she identified the negative word evil or the positive word kind. Development across lifespan. Experiences in a person's life are a major source of how self esteem develops. In the early years of a child's life, parents have a significant influence on self esteem and can be considered the main source of positive and negative experiences as a child will have. Unconditional love from parents helps a child develop a stable sense of being cared for and respected. These feelings translate into later effects on self esteem as a child grows older. Students in elementary school who have high self esteem tend to have authoritative parents who are caring, supportive adults who set clear standards for their child and allow them to voice their opinion in decision making. Although studies thus far have reported only a correlation of warm, supportive parenting styles, mainly authoritative and permissive, with children having high self esteem, these parenting styles could easily be thought of as having some casual effect in self esteem development. Childhood experiences that contribute to healthy self esteem include being listened to, being spoken to respectfully, receiving appropriate attention and affection, having accomplishments recognized and mistakes or failures acknowledged and accepted. Experiences that contribute to low self esteem include being harshly criticized, being physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, being ignored, ridiculed, or teased, or being expected to be perfect all the time. During school aged years, academic achievement is a significant contributor to self esteem development. Consistently achieving success or consistently failing will have a strong effect on students' individual self esteem. However, students can also experience low self esteem while in school. For example, they may not have academic achievements or they live in a troubled environment outside of school. Issues like the ones previously stated can cause adolescents to doubt themselves. Social experiences are another important contributor to self esteem. As children go through school, they begin to understand and recognize differences between themselves and their classmates. Using social comparisons, children assess whether they did better or worse than classmates in different activities. These comparisons play an important role in shaping the child's self esteem and influence the positive or negative feelings they have about themselves. As children go through adolescence, peer influence becomes much more important. Adolescents make appraisals of themselves based on their relationships with close friends. Successful relationships among friends are very important to the development of high self esteem for children. Social acceptance brings about confidence and produces high self esteem, whereas rejection from peers and loneliness brings about self doubts and produces low self esteem. Adolescence shows an increase in self esteem that continues to increase in young adulthood and middle age. A decrease is seen from middle age to old age, with varying findings on whether it is a small or large decrease. Reasons for the variability could be because of differences in health, cognitive ability, and socioeconomic status in old age. No differences have been found between males and females in their development of self esteem. Multiple cohort studies show that there is not a difference in the lifespan trajectory of self esteem between generations due to societal changes such as great inflation in education or the presence of social media. High levels of mastery, low risk taking, and better health are ways to predict higher self esteem. In terms of personality, emotionally stable, extroverted, and conscientious individuals experience higher self esteem. These predictors have shown us that self esteem has trait like qualities by remaining stable over time, like personality and intelligence. However, this does not mean it cannot be changed. Hispanic adolescents have a slightly lower self esteem than their black and white peers, but then slightly higher levels by age 30. African Americans have a sharper increase in self esteem in adolescence and young adulthood compared to whites. However, during old age, they experience a more rapid decline in self esteem. Shame. Shame can be a contributor to those with problems of low self esteem. Feelings of shame usually occur because of a situation where the social self is devalued, such as a socially evaluated poor performance. A poor performance leads to higher responses of psychological states that indicate a threat to the social self, namely a decrease in social self esteem and an increase in shame. This increase in shame can be helped with self compassion, real self, ideal self, and dreaded self. These are three levels of self evaluation development in relation to the real self, ideal self, and the dreaded self. The real, ideal, and dreaded selves develop in children in a sequential pattern on cognitive levels. Moral judgment stages individuals describe their real, ideal, and dreaded selves with stereotypical labels, such as nice or bad. Individuals describe their ideal and real selves in terms of disposition for actions or as behavioral habits. The dreaded self is often described as being unsuccessful or as having bad habits. Ego development stages. Individuals describe their ideal and real selves in terms of traits that are based on attitudes as well as actions. The dreaded self is often described as having failed to meet social expectations or as self centered. Self understanding stages. Individuals describe their ideal and real selves as having unified identities or characters. Descriptions of the dreaded self focus on a failure to live up to one's ideals or role expectations, often because of real world problems. This development brings with it increasingly complicated and encompassing moral demands. This level is where individual self esteem can suffer because they do not feel as though they are living up to certain expectations. This feeling will moderately affect one's self esteem, with an even larger effect seen when individuals believe they are becoming their dreaded selves. Types. High. People with a healthy level of self esteem firmly believe in certain values and principles and are ready to defend them even when finding opposition, feeling secure enough to modify them in light of experience, are able to act according to what they think to be the best choice, trusting their own judgment, and not feeling guilty when others do not like their choice. Do not lose time worrying excessively about what happened in the past, nor about what could happen in the future. They learn from the past and plan for the future, but live in the present intensely, fully trust in their capacity to solve problems, not hesitating after failures and difficulties. They ask others for help when they need it, consider themselves equal in dignity to others, rather than inferior or superior, while accepting differences in certain talents, personal prestige, or financial standing, understanding how they are in interesting and valuable person for others, at least for those with whom they have a friendship. Resist manipulation. Collaborate with others only if it seems appropriate and convenient. Admit and accept different internal feelings and drives, either positive or negative, revealing those drives to others only when they choose. Are able to enjoy a great variety of activities, are sensitive to feelings and needs of others, respect generally accepted social rules, and claim no right or desire to prosper at others' expense, can work toward finding solutions and voice discontent without belittling themselves or others when challenges arise. Secure versus defensive. A person can have high self esteem and hold it confidently where they do not need reassurance from others to maintain their positive self view, whereas others with defensive high self esteem may still report positive self evaluations on the Rosenberg scale, as all high self esteem individuals do. However, their positive self views are fragile and vulnerable to criticism. Defensive high self esteem individuals internalize subconscious self doubts and insecurities, causing them to react very negatively to any criticism they may receive. There is a need for constant positive feedback from others from for these individuals to maintain their feelings of self-worth. The necessity of repeated praise can be associated with boastful, arrogant behavior or sometimes even aggressive and hostile feelings toward anyone who questions the individual's self-worth. An example of threatened egotism. The Journal of Educational Psychology conducted a study in which they used a sample of 383 Malaysian undergraduates participating in work integrated learning WIL programs across five public universities to test the relationship between self esteem and other psychological attributes, such as self efficacy and self confidence. This results demonstrated that self esteem has a positive and significant relationship with self confidence and self efficacy, since students with higher self esteem had better performances at university than those with lower self esteem. It was concluded that higher education institutions and employers should emphasize the importance of undergraduate self esteem development. Implicit, explicit narcissism, and threatened egotism. Implicit self esteem refers to a person's disposition to evaluate themselves positively or negatively in a spontaneous, automatic, or unconscious manner. It contrasts with explicit self esteem, which entails more conscious and reflective self evaluation. Both explicit self esteem and implicit self esteem are subtypes of self esteem proper. Narcissism is a disposition people may have that represents an excessive love for oneself. It is characterized by an inflated view of self worth. Individuals who score high on narcissism measures, Robert Raskin's 40 item true or false test, would likely select true to such statements as, "If I ruled the world, it would be a much better place." There is only a moderate correlation between narcissism and self esteem. That is to say, that an individual can have high self esteem but low narcissism, or can be a conceited, obnoxious person and score high self esteem and high narcissism. Threatened egotism is characterized as a response to criticism that threatens the ego of narcissists. They often react in a hostile and aggressive manner. Low self esteem can result from various factors, including genetic factors, physical appearance or weight, mental health issues, socioeconomic status, significant emotional experiences, social stigma, peer pressure, or bullying. A person with low self esteem may show some of the following characteristics: heavy self criticism and dissatisfaction, the hypersensitivity to criticism with resentment against critics and feelings of being attacked, chronic indecision, and an exaggerated fear of mistakes, excessive will to please and unwillingness to displease any petitioner, perfectionism, which can lead to frustration when perfection is not achieved, neurotic guilt, dwelling on or exaggerating the magnitude of past mistakes, floating hostility and general defensiveness and irritability without any proximate cause, pessimism and a general negative outlook, envy, invidiousness, or general resentment, sees temporary setbacks as permanent, intolerable conditions. Individuals with low self esteem tend to be critical of themselves. Some depend on the approval and praise of others when evaluating self worth. Others may measure their likability in terms of successes. Others will accept themselves if they succeed, but will not if they fail. People who suffer from chronic low self esteem are at higher risk for experiencing psychotic disorders, and this behavior is closely linked to forming psychotic symptoms as well. Metacognitive therapy, EMDR technique, mindfulness based cognitive therapy, rationale, emotional emotive behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and trait and construct therapies have been shown to improve the patient's self esteem. The three states. This classification, proposed by Martin Ross, distinguishes three states of self esteem compared to the feats, triumphs, honors, virtues, and the anti feats, defeats, embarrassment, shame, etc. of the individuals. Shattered. The individual does not regard himself as valuable or lovable. They may be overwhelmed by defeat or shame, or see themselves as such, and they name their anti feat. For example, if they consider that being over a certain age is an anti feat, they define themselves with the name of their anti feat and say, I am old. They express actions and feelings such as pity, insulting themselves, and they may become paralyzed by their sadness. Vulnerable. The individual has a generally positive self image. However, their self esteem is also vulnerable to the perceived risk of an imminent anti feat, such as defeat, embarrassment, shame, discredit. Consequently, they are often nervous and regularly use defensive mechanisms. A typical protection mechanism of those with vulnerable self esteem may consist in avoiding decision making, although such individuals may outwardly exhibit great self confidence. The underlying reality may be just the opposite. The apparent self confidence is indicative of their heightened fear of anti feats and the fragility of their self esteem. They may also try to blame others to protect their self image from situations that would threaten it. They may employ defense mechanisms, including attempting to lose at games and other competitions in order to protect their self image by publicly disassociating themselves from a need to win and asserting an independence from social acceptance which they may deeply desire. In this deep fear of being unaccepted by an individual's peers, they make poor life choices by making risky decisions. Strong. People with strong self esteem have a positive self image and enough strength so that anti feats do not subdue their self esteem. They have less fear of failure. These individuals appear humble, cheerful, and this shows a certain strength not to boast about feats and not to be afraid of anti feats. They are capable of fighting with all their might to achieve their goals because if things go wrong, their self esteem will not be affected. They can acknowledge their own mistakes precisely because of their self image is strong, and this acknowledgement will not impair or affect their self image. They live with less fear of losing social prestige and with more happiness and general well being. However, no type of self esteem is indestructible, and due to certain situations or circumstances in life, one can fail from this level into any other state of self esteem. Contingent versus non contingent. A distinction is made between contingent or conditional, non conditioned or unconditional self esteem. Contingent self esteem is derived from external sources, such as what others say, one's success or failure, one's competence, or relationship. Contingent self esteem. Therefore, contingent self esteem is marked by instability, unreliability, and vulnerability. Persons lacking a non contingent self esteem are predisposed to an incessant pursuit of self value. However, because of the pursuit of contingent self esteem is based on receiving approval, it is doomed to fail, as no one receives constant approval, and disapproval often evokes depression. Furthermore, fear of disapproval inhibits activities in which failure is possible. Non contingent self esteem is described as true, stable, and solid. It springs from a belief that one is acceptable, period, acceptable before life itself, ontologically acceptable. Belief that one is ontologically acceptable is to believe that one's acceptability is the way things are without contingency. In this belief, as expounded by theologian Paul Tillich, acceptability is not based on a person's virtue. It is an acceptance given in spite of our guilt, not because we have no guilt. Psychiatrist Thomas A. Harris drew on Tillich for his classic I'm okay, you're okay, that addresses non contingent self esteem. Harris translated tillage acceptable by the vernacular okay, a term that means acceptable. The Christian message, said Harris, is not you can be okay if It is you're accepted unconditionally. The secure non-contingent self-esteem springs from the belief that one is ontologically acceptable and accepted. Domain-specific self-esteem, whereas global self-esteem addresses how individuals appraise themselves in their entirety. Domain-specific self-esteem facets relate to how they appraise themselves in various pertinent domains of life, such as functionally distinct facets of self esteem may comprise self evaluations in social, emotional, body related, school performance related, and creative artistic domains. They have been found to be predictive of outcomes related to psychological functioning, health and education, and work. Low self esteem in the social domain, self perceived social competence, for example, has been repeatedly identified as a risk factor for bullying victimization. Importance: Abraham Maslow states that psychological health is not possible unless the essential core of the person is fundamentally accepted, loved, and respected by others and by oneself. Self-esteem allows people to face life with more confidence, benevolence, and optimism, and thus easily reach their goals and self-actualize. Self-esteem may make people convinced they deserve happiness. Understanding this is fundamental and universally beneficial, since the development of positive self esteem increases the capacity to treat other people with respect, benevolence, and goodwill, thus favoring rich interpersonal relationships and avoiding destructive ones. For erich from the love of others and love of ourselves are not alternatives. On the contrary, an attitude of love toward themselves will be found in all those who are capable of loving others. Self esteem allows creativity at the workplace and is especially critical condition for teaching professions. Jose Vicente Bonet claims that the importance of self esteem is obvious as a lack of self esteem is, he says, not a loss of esteem from others but self rejection. Bonnet claims that this corresponds to major depressive disorder. Freud also claimed that the depressive has suffered an extraordinary diminution in his self regard, an impoverishment of his ego on a grand scale. He has lost his self respect. The Yogyakarta Principles, the document on international human rights law, addresses the discriminatory attitude toward LGBT people that make their self esteem low to be subject to human rights violation, including human trafficking. The World Health Organization recommends in preventing suicide, published in 2000, that strengthening student self esteem is important to protect children and adolescents against mental distress and despondency, enabling them to cope adequately with difficult and stressful life situations. Other than increased happiness, higher self esteem is also known to correlate with a better ability to cope with stress and a higher likeness of taking on difficult tasks relative to those with low self esteem. Correlations: from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, many Americans assumed as a matter of course that student self esteem acted as a critical factor in the grades that they earned in school, in their relationships with their peers, and in their later success in life. Under this assumption, some American groups created programs which aimed to increase the self esteem of students. Until the 1990s, little peer reviewed and controlled research took place on this topic. Peer reviewed research undertaken since then has not validated previous assumptions. Recent research indicates that inflating students' self esteem in and of itself has no positive effect on grades. Roy Baumeister has shown that inflating self esteem by itself can actually decrease grades. The relationship involving self esteem and academic results does not signify that high self esteem contributes to high academic results. It simply means that high self esteem may be accomplished as a result of high academic performance due to the other variables of social interactions and life events affecting this performance. Attempts by pro esteem advocates to encourage self pride in students solely by reason of their uniqueness as human beings will fail if feelings of well being are not accompanied by well doing. It is only when students engage in personally meaningful endeavors for which they can be justifiably proud that self confidence grows, and it is this growing self assurance that in turn triggers further achievement. High self esteem has a high correlation to self reported happiness. Whether this is a casual relationship has not been established. The relationship between self esteem and life satisfaction is stronger in individualistic cultures. Additionally, self esteem has been found to be related to forgiveness in close relationships, and that people with high self esteem will be more forgiving than people with low self esteem. High self esteem does not prevent children from smoking, drinking, taking drugs, or engaging in early sex. One exception is that high self esteem reduces the chances of bulimia in females. Neuroscience. In research conducted in 2014 by Robert S. Chavez and Todd F. Heatherton, it was found that self esteem is related to the connectivity of the frontostriatal circuit. The frontostriatal pathway connects the medial prefrontal cortex, which deals with self knowledge, to the ventral striatum, which deals with feelings of motivation and reward. Stronger anatomical pathways are correlated with higher longer term self esteem, while stronger functional connectivity is correlated with higher short term self esteem. Criticism and controversy. The American psychologist Albert Ellis criticized on numerous occasions the concept of self esteem as essentially self defeating and ultimately destructive, although acknowledging the human propensity and tendency to ego rating as innate. He has critiqued the philosophy of self esteem as unrealistic, illogical, and self and socially destructive, often doing more harm than good. Questioning the foundations and usefulness of generalized ego strength, he has claimed that self esteem is based on arbitrary definitional premises and overgeneralized perfectionistic and grandiose thinking, acknowledging that rating and valuing behaviors and characteristics is functional and even necessary. He sees rating and valuing human beings' totality and total selves as irrational and unethical. The healthier alternative to self esteem, according to him, is unconditional self acceptance and unconditional other acceptance. Rational emotive behavior therapy is a psychotherapy based on this approach. There seem to be only two clearly demonstrated benefits of high self esteem. First, it increases initiative, probably because it lends confidence. People with high self esteem are more willing to act on their beliefs, to stand up for what they believe in, to approach others, to risk new undertakings. This unfortunately includes being extra willing to do stupid or destructive things, even when everyone else advises against them. It can also lead people to ignore sensible advice, as they stubbornly keep wasting time and money on hopeless causes. False attempts. For persons with low self esteem, any positive stimulus will temporarily raise self esteem. Therefore, possession, sex, success, or physical appearance will produce the development of self esteem, but the development is ephemeral at best. Such attempts to raise one's self esteem by positive stimulus produce a boom or bust pattern. Compliments and positive feedback produce a boost, but a bust follows a lack of such feedback. For a person whose self esteem is contingent, success is not extra sweet, but failure is extra bitter. As narcissism, life satisfaction, happiness, healthy behavioral practices, perceived efficacy, and academic success and adjustment have been associated with having high levels of self esteem. Harter, 1987, Hubner, 1991, Lipschitz, Elol, and Itzaki, 2005, Broomberger, 1995, Swenson and Prilo, 2005, Yarcheski and Machel, 1989. However, a common mistake is to think that loving oneself is necessarily equivalent to narcissism, as opposed, for example, to what Eric Erikson speaks of as a post narcissistic love of the ego. People with a healthy self esteem accept and love themselves unconditionally, acknowledging both virtues and faults in the self, and yet, in spite of everything, is able to continue to love themselves. In narcissists, by contrast, an uncertainty about their own worth gives rise to a self protective but often totally spurious aura of grandiosity, producing the class of narcissists for people with very high but insecure self esteem, fluctuating with each new episode of social praise or rejection. Narcissism can thus be seen as a symptom of fundamentally low self esteem, that is, lack of love towards oneself, but often accompanied by an immense increase in self esteem, based on the defense mechanism of denial by overcompensation. Idealized love of self rejected the part of him that he denigrates. This destructive little child within, instead, the narcissist emphasizes their virtues in the presence of others, just to try to convince themselves that they are a valuable person and to try to stop feeling ashamed for their faults. Such people with unrealistically inflated self views, which may be especially unstable and highly vulnerable to negative information, tend to have poor social skills.